what we have in mind for this session is essentially we will just look together through these 4 manuscripts. I want to show you some of the equipment that I was talking about. This is an example of a light wand. This is basically a kind of like flashlight that you can find at a hardware store that operates on batteries and easily traveled, because flashlight is something even usually you can have in your carry-on. It depends on the TSA agent that you're dealing with, but anyway, something that you want to check and be sure, like the reading room will permit you to use it if they don't have such a thing as this, but something that can be very useful for transmitted light, observation and transmitted light. With a thing like this, again, you just have to be very careful that you can get it positioned in such a way if you need to actually take photographs or something like that. It's not always ideal for that type of documentation, but for just observing the watermarks and then and other features and making note of them, it can be very valuable. So you can see it's more powerful than a typical flashlight, but even the phone light is pretty powerful and adequate. Another thing that we have is a tape measure. So again, because it is retractable, then it is easy to travel with you. So this has also you can see like a plastic end, not one of those metal ends that clamps on, so it's less nefarious, I don't know, like dangerous. So in any case, so these are some of the tools that you might want to have. Again, as I suggested, potentially your own measuring tape or measurement ruler, because that way you can be internally consistent in your measurements. Okay, so that's an example of that. So we have the first manuscript here. So now that we've all situated with the document camera, I'm going to lift the book, because again, the first thing I would like to do is check all the edges of the text block to see if there are any inscriptions. And I don't see any inscriptions. I'm also trying to show you. However, on the spine, we have what some might consider to be an obnoxious collection label. Which is interesting, and we would definitely want to document this. And this might be a situation where we would pursue what collection this pertains to. Is this from the collections here? Is this from a different collection? What can we associate this with? But it would definitely be something that we would want to document. And then we would go from there to describing the binding. Does anybody recognize this material? What material is that? Can you tell from the image on the screen? Yes, yeah. So it's a lacquerwork cover. And we have a central ornament, actually almond shape. We can call it a mandorla if we wish, with floral composition. And then we have pendants as well that also contain floral forms. If we want to be more detailed, we can mention what looks like peonies and violets and so forth. I mean, anyway, that's left to you. And then, we would want to note the borders. And of course, if we want to mention coloration, that sort of thing. Also, we want to carefully check the spine, because it is not uncommon with lacquerwork bindings that you have a 2-piece spine. Usually the spine is in leather, but I don't see any seam that suggests that this is 2-piece. That doesn't mean that it isn't, but we wouldn't suggest that it is, because we don't see evidence of it. There's a tiny trace. I don't know if anybody else can see this, but there's a tiny trace of what could be an overlapping flange right here along this edge, which would be very subtly done if that's how they did it. So rather than place the overlap, trying to align it along when the edge sort of the joint, they've actually got it kind of lined up within the joint here. And so that's a possibility. So if we might want to look at that more carefully. That might be a case where we want to take a photograph and zoom in, or use a magnifying glass, as someone mentioned. But that is definitely something that we would want to check. So as far as conditions, it's a pretty decent condition. If we wanted to look at the board corners, we could see that there looks like there's some evidence here little bit of evidence of delamination. You know, we're likely dealing with pasteboards, but and especially here, you know, you can see, but otherwise, if we look for in-bands, so we actually, so it looks like our in-bands are not worked chevron in-bands. So we would definitely want to note that we have a different style of in-band that has been used.
Quick question.
Yeah.
I noticed that it looks like the binding extends a little bit, tiny bit beyond the text block on the end.
Yeah, thank you, yeah.
So is that enough to qualify as squares or not?
So it could be. It is definitely something that we would want to note. And we would measure, again, if we're being true to the demonstration, you know, we would measure here, try to measure at the nearer to the spine to see if there was any like significant variation along the width of the cover as far as the dimensions were concerned, and then kind of present an average. So this looks like about 21 centimeters. I often go for millimeters just because sometimes when we're talking about what you're asking about, the distinction in measurement between the text block and the cover, sometimes it's really just a matter of millimeters, but a matter of millimeters can account for squares. And so I would say that, yeah, we would want to suggest that. So yeah, there are a few almost 5 millimeter difference in the dimension. So that could be sufficient enough to say. Now, when it comes to the foredge, though, it's not as disparate, I guess you would say. There is still, it is not flush, but it is not quite as mismatched. Now, one way that, without making any presumption about whether the intentionality was squares or something else, initially is just to document the mismatch in measurement, and then later, as you're assessing, so you know, the next stage of moving through the binding will be to check the attachment and to see if we see any traces of repair or reattachment or any other indication that the text block may have had a different cover at one stage, or maybe even that the cover could potentially have been attached to another book. You know, if you feel comfortable ascertaining that sort of thing. One thing I'm seeing right away, actually, that causes me to want to look back to the spine to see if there are any ridges on the spine. Can you see the pink tapes? I'm not convinced that you can see them. So down here, right there, can you see a little pink tape right there? You can see it? Okay, 1, 2, 3. So it'll be interesting when we check the sew. That suggests to me that this is sewn over supports. It continues here, but we'd want to check the sewing to see if that's the case. We could check that now. This is a Persianate hand. I would expect quaternion, so that's going to be, excuse me, so that would be sort of the first spot I would check when it came to looking for the sewing. There it is. And yes, can you see the sewing? The sewing is in pink thread. What is the best angle? Can you see it? Okay. So it looks like the sewing is passing in and out over those supports. Okay. So that's interesting, and that's something that, you know, first became apparent. So also, this first quire was a quaternion, as we expected. It may be that the rest continues, but then also that what we're seeing here is a bit of the sewing. We also can see traces of spine lining here, and we see also here this very interesting paper. Looks like a foil stamped paper. Which has been used for the hinge here, but obviously some damage has occurred. We can see where it was once attached, but it has now detached. The interesting thing to notice here is this writing up here, okay, that looks like it has been partially obscured by the hinge. So that suggests that the hinge obviously was placed after the writing and potentially without respecting the writing that was already there. The question is at what stage? So if we look back here, we can try to get a sense if we're seeing something similar. Altogether, basically what we're trying to decide is, was this particular cover original to this text block, where maybe, or not? And for example, does this text block maybe even then trimmed down to try to suit, or had it already been trimmed and then just associated with this cover? And we want to keep all these possibilities in mind, perhaps not, because of the mismatch. And then maybe if we look through, we'll be able to see other signs. I'm not anticipating, but we could potentially see other signs of trimming. Like for example here. So I will tell you, this is actually a wonderful example. What often happens, especially in context of Persianate manuscript production, you will have on the far outer margin where they're intended to disappear with trimming or mostly disappear with trimming, you will have the text of what will be later entered in red ink out here on the margin. Sometimes it doesn't get completely trimmed away, so you can actually, see here we just see the last part of it, of the word. It looks like tekmila, so we just see the mla, but you get the idea. So that also suggests that the trimming, we know that trimming went on, but the ultimate question is, to what extent was this text block intended for this particular cover? So I think it still remains an open question. All that to say, there's still a little bit of uncertainty here, but we might want to continue checking. The fact that we're seeing, traces of adhesive and paint that's extending right up into here would suggest that potentially some of this text had been covered. And this is unlikely to have been original to the transcript. So that suggests a bit of distance in time between when this cover was applied and when the actual transcript was produced. So in other words, this cover may not be original. Sorry, it's very long story short. Okay, so that's the cover. We can make a few other comments about the cover, I guess, but doublures would be, if we want to refer to them as doublures or board linings, which ordinarily, it's interesting, ordinarily with lacquer covers, you won't necessarily have a flyleaf. It sort of depends on the situation. So they won't necessarily do like paste down flyleaf situation where that's all one continuous piece, but more just like a separate doublure or a separate board lining and then a hinge, as in this case, or some other form of attachment. The textile lining that we see, that's fairly common for this type of attachment. What's interesting, I don't know if you can see this. Let me see if I can accentuate this in any way. There is a watermark here that is actually, the impression is visible on the surface. Can you see it in the raking light? I don't know what's possible for you to see, how, because your angle is different than mine. Yeah, and it's a crown. Not seeing it at all. Let me try something else. This is fun working with the document camera. It's adding a new dimension. Tell me, are you seeing anything? I wonder. In any case, you can trust me, you can check later. We can try again. So it's there, it's a watermarked paper. It's a laid paper. We can look at it later. This is a tricky part. Again, we're talking about, how difficult it is in a digital environment. Just sometimes it's impossible. But sometimes, it's a little better. So that's pretty much what we can say about the cover. Now we can start checking for, and again, we would have measured, we can start checking for inscriptions and so forth. We definitely, I think, immediately see some inscriptions here on the board lining. Here's something that's been partly expunged, another that's been partly expunged. So we might associate those with previous ownership, that someone has tried to eliminate that. There's a little more, some other traces of, potentially traces of writing up here. And actually, again, I see writing obscured here by this doubler hinge. All of this is kind of reinforcing to me this idea that this cover either was repaired. This represents a reattachment, which is also a very real possibility. You know, this cover was always intended for this book, but it just had to be repaired at some point and reattached. The thing is, we don't see very much in the way of traces of an earlier attachment. So that would be an open question. If it was just being repaired, how was it attached to begin with? Or in the previous, the previous attachment. So we can note the presence of these annotations that we're seeing, and then we can start checking what we see, beginning with the folios of the text block. So we see several different inscriptions here. Some are in English, obviously some in Latin script, I should say, and some happen to be in English, but Latin script in pencil, and then we have some inscriptions in ink that are in Arabic script, and then we have a couple of stamp seal impressions, one of which has been expunged, looks like kind of someone shoved it off with their finger. And then we have a much smaller seal impression here, oval, that is a little bit difficult to read. And then there's the traces of a statement here that has been pretty well expunged. So all that, again, suggests a series of ownership. And we want to make note of these things. So typically with characterizing seals, we want to characterize the shape and potentially the color of ink if we need to go to that level of detail, but mainly the shape. And then if we can make out the inscription, if there's a date, etc., then we do that. But this is a good place where I would be making a reference photograph, because that's definitely something that I would want to be able to zoom, to enlarge, and not just use the magnifying glass, because I'd want to go actually to really significant, level of detail to be able to check that. So, Rawada Nafus. So we get a title, and we have an attribution, Mir Muhammad, or Saleh Khan Abadi. So that we would definitely make note of that. We have inventory numbers. I'm guessing this actually matches what's here. And then we have potentially from Manassian's collection, the inventory numbering that was associated that way. There's a date here with this inscription from, it looks like 56. Potentially interpret that as a date, maybe not. And then you have here also collection number, box 23, manuscript 140. So all of that, you have all of that to make note of. Okay, now we're already at the opening of the text. So that means that we're not dealing with fly leaves, as I think I've already alluded to. One thing that I'm afraid you probably can't see, the impression of the ruling board is really clear right here. So can you see it? Okay, good, thank you. So that will ease our measurement when it comes to the written area. Actually, and also the copyist seems to have adhered quite faithfully to that ruling. So we would want to measure again the dimensions of the written area. We'd count the lines per page, and we'd want to pay attention here to our opening, start transcribing our opening, and then venture as far as we needed to see if the author is going to give any mention or identification of the title of the work, and also any self-identification. So we would spend a bit of time doing that. We had already ventured here to the center of the first gathering. We want to make sure that we count properly. So quaternion, again, pink thread. It looks like it's probably silk, but we wouldn't necessarily venture any sort of guess at this point, but what we want to mention is that it's on what looks to be these 3 supports that we can actually see over here. So that's really quite interesting, or tapes. The paper is highly burnished. Can you see that from your perspective? Yes, no, yeah, okay. Yes, no, no, okay. Well, it's very highly burnished, almost to glossy actually in its appearance. And I can even tell just by looking at it that it's laid. The question would be whether it's machine laid. And so I'm seeing, I'm seeing Cyrillic marks in the paper. So that's obviously going to be something that's really hard for me to do on the document camera. But by just, if I can show you, what I'm trying to show you is by just turning the page just a little bit, I get enough light from the overhead and then obscured otherwise that it basically gives me a transmitted light view of the page. And that's all I really have to do. And I turn my head, you know, again, rather than like manipulating the book, I just tilt my head to get a good sense of what's going on. So we're starting to see, get an idea of the paper that we're dealing with. Now, we can check, we can go forward and see if this is a true quaternion or we have some other situation going on. The numbering here is peculiar because this starts at 2. Not sure why that is, but that would be something that we would need to note. Why would that be? I don't know. Missing, yeah, could there be a missing folio or flyleaf? Who paginated this? Because it's paginated in Arabic numerals. So it looks to be like a Western situation, but why they started at 2? Did they paginate this? No, they did paginate this, but they paginated it at the end. Did they? Oh, yes, thank you. They did paginate the, oh God. They paginated the board lining. Excuse me. So, all right. So the board lining has been paginated. I wonder if this was digitized, and that was very important potentially for the digitization. And that could be one explanation. So, okay, but that is going to affect, okay. So how did I know? What was immediately off to me is that there were odd numbers on the versos. That is like a weird, that's a weird situation. Ordinarily, you're going to have even numbers on the versos, okay? So I knew something weird was going on. Okay, but we need to make note of that the pagination actually starts with the board lining. Yes, sir.
So if you're doing a collation of a book like this, do you go with the pagination that like the institution uses, or do you make your own, like, you know, 1 recto to like 8 or so is this, or do you go with like, you know, 1 to 17 based on like those pencil numbers that happen to be there?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. The answer to the collation part of your question is you count. You do your own count, regardless of what is written on the thing and however many different paginations or foliations there might be. You just count. If you're going to collate it, then you count the number of folios between sewings. Okay, and the way I like to do it, what I do is I indicate the pagination that shows up where there's a center, where there's sewing or the center of a gathering, but then I make sure that there's not a discrepancy, because oftentimes, I know this from experience, it is so easy to make a mistake in pagination, like to skip ahead, to drop like 100, or to to add 20, or because sometimes you just get, you get off in like a trance, and you can just make mistakes. So you want to kind of check it against and then try to catch if there happen to be any mistakes in the pagination, but ultimately you're just trying to get a count for yourself. Where you do want to reference whatever extant pagination there is when you're identifying where a particular feature appears. So if you're indicating that on page 10, there's an marginal annotation in red ink of some kind, which you can sort out later what that is, then that's fine to do. and you want to reference that, just that whatever pagination there is. But when it comes to the collation, like here is a correction. Do you see this little sign? Often that will indicate omission or like variation. So it looks like here, like maybe there's a little bit of both going on. And then the logograph saha at the end, that again reinforces that we're dealing with a correction. This is a signe de renvoi that's uniting this with the place in the text that it pertains to. If we wanted to mention this for some reason, this particular correction, then we would say page 13. But we want to keep counting. Okay, so ostensibly, 4 more folios later, that would be the end of the first quire. And here we have an interesting annotation, awwal mutala'a. Okay, that's interesting. And that is on what we would potentially, we're noticing some other corrections here. 2 actually, looks like. Someone was asking me earlier about abbreviations. Gatchik has a wonderful appendix of abbreviations in the Vademecum. Okay, and here we are at another center. So far we've got 2 quaternions. We'll just check and make sure that this one is regular. Here's another correction. Wow. So we count. So far, so good. We don't see another annotation on what could be the recto of the first folio of the next quire, but we can continue to see. If we're getting a good string of quaternions here, yep, we are. So we can just go with that. We can say, you know, seems to be chiefly quaternions. If we wanted to be more comprehensive, we would keep going with our collation. Okay, do you see? So as we were doing that, we got to see a lot. We saw a lot of corrections. We saw what may be notabilia here, side heads in red on the margins. We're seeing traces like here of elements that probably would have been entered in red, but there's lacuna left. Do you see that? But you see also the trace here for what presumably should have been entered that was not, for some reason. So that's an interesting situation and maybe something that you want to note. But yeah, so in the course of just that little bit of collation, here's some other lacuna that have been left. So we're getting a good sense. Now, has anyone seen catchwords? Yeah, there's one. So catchwords are present. What is the script that we're looking at? It's an naskh. Yeah, it is. It's a Persianate naskh, so it may not be, or naskhi, it may not be so familiar. But yeah, that's what it is. Do you see serifs? So most of the vertical strokes I'm seeing do not have head serifs. Okay, what is the pointing like? So one distinction would be pointing in strokes, like curved strokes, or in distinct dots. So here it looks to be actually, so these are conjoined, what I would actually call conjoined dots, where the two dots are actually placed so closely together, they're basically like unified. So that's how I characterize that. If we're looking at a final, like an isolated noon, like here's a good one, that's a little bit superscripted. That's something we can comment on. Actually, they tend to be superscripting the end of each line. And that is because this person seems to be so dedicated to maintaining the, their adherence to this layout. So they're superscripting at the end of each line, which would be interesting to note. And then do you see this noon? So it's a fairly tall bowl and the point is above it. Can I zoom in? I don't know. Oh, okay. Whoa. I can, yeah. Yes, ma'am. This noon right here, the shadow. This noon right here. Tall, elongated vertically, the bowl, and then the point is above, not set down in. Okay, we expect the final kaf to have the sarkash or the shat. So we would probably see that. Now, something else you can say about things like ya, or whether or not they're what we call marduda, like are they reverting back, marju or marduda, or are they otherwise formed, like just curving out? You'd want to say something. So these descenders like ra, wa, you would want to say whether or not, you know, you can comment on how particularly curved they are. Sometimes they will be joined to like following letters. They might even be like elated to following letters. And you have, it looks like you have a good bit of that situation going on here. Here's actually a couple of head serifs. So they kind of strayed from that practice. Am I even within your, yeah, I am, okay, in your field of view. You might find that with kaf, they also use the little tiny version of kaf, like they might add it, especially in final. I was noticing, was there a situation over here? That might be something else you can comment on. Here's an example of kaf mabsuta. But on the whole, that they haven't been using that. That's not preferred. Okay, there are other sorts of things we could notice. There's a slight inclination to the left, but otherwise they're pretty much adhering to the baseline. Other than this superscripting, which would be nice to note, they're mainly adhering to the baseline. They're not like descending to the baseline or anything. Okay, you can comment more on the hand as you go along. So it looks to me like many of the counters are closed or nearly closed. So that would be, so with meme, it's actually left a little bit open, but the ultimate question often will be, what do they do with final ha or ta marbuta if they're even treating it as a ta? That's a good letter to address. Okay, but a good solid Persian nas, I mean, all things considered. Okay, use of red ink. We've already seen use of red ink. And then also we have keywords that are in red ink, and we have overlining in red ink. So that's something to note. And then we have these marginal annotations that are in red ink and look to be, again, potentially be serving as side heads. You'd want to just pay a little more attention to what's there. Also corrections we've already seen. This is, are you still able to see what I'm seeing? This is in a different hand, okay, and a different ink, so much later. Whereas these corrections and even these annotations appear to be in the same hand. Even though this is in a different ink and it looks a little more hastily written, and it certainly looks like the pen was a little bit different, it does look like it was in the same hand. And these are definitely in the same hand. Okay, so now we could go a little bit further. Periodically, as you're looking through, you can continue checking the paper. See if you see, so right now, all I'm seeing are like these series of letters again in Cyrillic. I haven't seen another motif yet, but I would want to keep checking until, I could potentially identify another motif or not, kind of rule it out. Okay, so at this stage, we could look quickly through to the center. Looks like there are a few other annotations here. You might want to check. That's in a different hand. You might want to try to get a quick sense of, like, that looks like potentially that it could be a kind of gloss or commentary. It's lengthier, certainly, and so you might want to take a closer look at that. There might be something you want to capture. Reference photograph. Here's another annotation, etc., and so forth. Paying attention to, if you recognize from the title the genre of the work, that can also help you get a sense of what's actually going to be annotated and what will be underlined. Where you see, another thing we typically indicate with characterizing the hand is whether or not it's been vocalized or not. And here, like when you have Quranic excerpts or other similar passages in Arabic, but especially Quranic excerpts, they tend to be fully vocalized. And sometimes there will be, as we've already discussed, there will be a shift in script if you are dealing with something other than nasr. Okay, so we're to the end of the volume. Also kind of checking. Yeah, they haven't, so far that, you know, those catchwords are matching. Okay, so we would check here. We've gotten to the end of the volume, and now we see this lovely shift in layout, leading us to what we hope would be a colophon. And so indeed, it looks like we are eventually coming to a colophon. And the question, of course, is going to be whether we're going to be dealing with an authorial colophon or a scribal colophon, that sort of thing. وتمت الكتاب الشريف بعون الله الملك الجليل في دوشنبه. Okay. And then دوهم شهر محرم الحرام. That is a typical epithet or honorific for Muharram. وشهادهم. They're giving, it looks like they're giving us the equivalent. Month, okay, and then eventually they're giving us the year. So that's all wonderful. We can calculate that. And then we have this seal impression. I'm sorry? Yes, exactly. Exactly, 1244. So sometimes it's tricky when it comes to the form and distinction between 2 and 3, like especially with Ottoman, not so much with in Iranian context, but with Ottoman context, they are really shifty with how they will pen 2 and 3. Sometimes 3 is like this and 2 is just this, and so you just have to be very careful, and you can usually figure out by looking at other numerals. In this case, we expect this to be a 2, 1244. So that's our year. We have our month and so forth and date, and so we can calculate. Now, what I was going to say about this seal is that this seal could indicate who the copyist was. What we would want to compare is if we have, because sometimes the copyists, that's the way they will only identify themselves by just putting their seal impression. It looks like it's similar in dimension to this, but we might want to check more carefully and see if they actually match, because that could be an indication that it was potentially someone later. But yes, so otherwise we have these annotations that we might want to characterize, look like excerpts. So we would want to make note of that. As far as we have no, don't have any real like visual content. So and ornament is limited just to use of the contrasting ink in this very functional way. We would want to transcribe the close of the text as well. We would want to document the colophon, you know, all the annotations that we've observed. And then, of course, when it comes to title author, just make sure like we've recorded what's here, but then we've also recorded what's here, but we would also want to record whatever we were able to discern here. I don't see any, you want to check carefully that there's not also another indication of the close, because sometimes within the colophon or just preceding the colophon, it is another place where the copyist will indicate a title, a version of the title, sometimes different than what has appeared elsewhere. And so you want to make sure to check for that and document it as well. So any questions about, you can indicate this slip or insert also, you know, why not? I mean, especially if you're going to be thorough, you would. At least we got to go through pretty thoroughly. I just want to show you a couple of quick things. So there's some significant damage here that you'd want to notice. So losses, you know, to the lower board, pest damage, etc. But what I want to show you, this is a seal of Solomon. Has anyone encountered this before? Okay, Ism al-Azam. So you'll find some writing about this, and you'll again find an introductory reference in Gatchik. So that if you encounter that, that's what that is. There's some pretty clear title statement and then ownership statements here, as well as scene impressions. Here you have, again, rule borders that don't continue, but they're at least there. Use of red ink, a lot more marginalia. And then it looks like what maybe collation marks are also showing up here. Anytime you see something that begins with balagha, that's very likely to be associated with a, and here you see balagha in the center, with a collation process. So that's what I'll say about that, just as an addition. This is a case where we have a different, definitely a different watermarked paper. And the hand is again a naskh, but yeah, we would definitely characterize it differently. What's interesting about this naskh is that it has some elements of nas ta'liq. We could go into that in detail. Now, when you have a format like this, the watermark is very often going to be down in the gutter. So that was a situation in the other manuscript too, and it'll be across the fold. So you'll see half of it in one folio, and then potentially on the other side of the sewing, you would see the rest of it. So you just have to kind of watch until you can kind of compose it for yourself. So that's just another thing to point out. Courtney, could I see, well, I guess could I see this one? Can I switch? Because I just want to point out, as far as distinction and binding, like here's a good example where we have a flap. So we'd want to make note of that. And then we have the use of marbled paper, so we could refer to those as doublures. Here is also, I wanted you to see that we have an edge title sort of situation, and we have some inscription also on the head edge, and then there's there's traces of something on the tail edge too. And then we have, you know, inscriptions beginning, and a lot of these. Okay, so this would be more approaching a nas ta'liq, and a lot of those, actually, those annotations were also in a nas ta'liq. So we have additional annotations in a different hand. Here's our sewing, which is failing. Ooh, yeah. And then we have another seal impression here. Use of red ink. And then we would again be checking for colophon, which fortunately we do have. Ittafaqa faragh or faraghi min musawwadat. That's interesting that they use that instead of tasweed. هذا الشرح مشرح. So, etc. That's another expression that often opens a colophon. Continues. We'll have time tomorrow to go into real detail, get intimate with the colophons. And then this will be the last one, and then we'll see. So this would be, you know, this has no flap, pretty well flush, lots of annotations. Ooh, a proper nas ta'liq. What's interesting here, this is a majmu'ah. So this is especially, thank you for your patience and your additional attention. So this is something that at least one group, I think, will have tomorrow. I'm not sure, actually, I don't remember now, but a majmu'ah is a situation, you know, where you have multiple works in a single volume. So here you want to be even more careful to pay attention to things like pagination, because you want to indicate opening and conclusion of a particular work and where you transition to a different work. Often it might be what we call a composite situation, where actually it's also on a different paper. And they might not be contemporary with one another. They might have later been bound together. They might have been copied in even different contexts and just later assembled into a single volume. Or it might be a majmu'ah situation where they're actually, there's a deliberate selection by a single copyist to incorporate all these works into a single volume. So you just want to be especially careful to check for multiple works, where they open and close, and then check the end of each. Like here, for example, is a date, hararahu fi shahr rabi' al-awwal, and we have a year, 1090. So, and actually it looks like we have a place. So we'd want to pay attention, varamin, so we have also a place. So we'd want to pay attention to all of that. When you have a majmu'ah, you want to check the end of each work to see if you have that sort of detail, try to get a sense of whether things are contemporary with one another or not, and then just take as much information as you can.